Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. I'm Forrest, and in this episode I'll be talking to Sandy Gibson, co-founder and chief innovation officer of Better Place Forests, an organization that supports people in their end-of-life arrangements while conserving and protecting natural areas. In doing so, they practice their core mission of helping every person to write a better ending to their story.
People still need ritual to say goodbye to their loved ones and to move on. People still want a sense of place, to know that they're a part of a community for future generations or to know that they'll be remembered. If they're choosing cremation, they typically don't want the offerings that are in traditional cemeteries. So we created a new option where people could choose a beautiful forest. They could choose a beautiful tree as their marker. And their family can come back into that beautiful forest and have that spreading experience and really have those memories of knowing that the person they love is in a beautiful place that they want to be.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Welcome, Sandy. Maybe you could orient our listeners by telling us what it is that you do day to day.
Thank you, Forrest. Really appreciate you having me. My name is Sandy Gibson. I'm the founder of Better Place Forests, and we are the first sustainable alternative to traditional cemeteries for families who choose cremation. How Better Place Forests works is that instead of a grave and a tombstone in a traditional cemetery and burying someone you love there, our families are choosing cremation. They're often hosting traditional funerals or hosting a celebration of life, and then they're bringing the ashes of their loved ones to the tree, and that's where we prepare the ashes and then spread them beneath that tree. And how it really works is that 80% of baby boomers are planning to choose cremation. They're typically not pre-purchasing cemetery plots the way that their parents did. And that's not because people have entirely moved away from tradition religion. People still need ritual to say goodbye to their loved ones and to move on. People still want a sense of place, to know that they're a part of a community for future generations or to know that they'll be remembered. If they're choosing cremation, they typically don't want the offerings that are in traditional cemeteries. So we created a new option where people could choose a beautiful forest. They could choose a beautiful tree as their marker. And their family can come back into that beautiful forest and have that spreading experience and really have those memories of knowing that the person they love is in a beautiful place that they want to be.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm wondering if you could talk about what's sustainable in terms of the environment in this new approach. And I ask that because listeners to this podcast are really concerned about becoming better earth keepers, finding ways to change their actions to make a positive impact in the world. So what's sustainable about Better Place Forests?
So first off, choosing cremation, even though cremation is energy intensive, is still much less energy intensive than a traditional burial. You don't have to make a big casket. You don't have to install a big tombstone. You don't have to dig out a very large amount of earth, which is mostly done by machines and not by people. There's the occasional cemetery where you might still have gravekeepers, but generally you're going to be bringing in a backhoe. So there's a lot of energy intensivity into the traditional funeral process. Our customers are choosing things like cremation, or they're choosing water cremation, which is much less energy intensive. And if they do choose cremation, we have a partnership with One Tree Planted where we plant impact trees. Those more than offset the emissions from carbon from their cremation. At a Better Place Forest level, to go further, by choosing us, they're helping contribute to the purchase, endowment, and permanent protection of the forest. So they know that they're contributing to creating and protecting a beautiful natural space.
So really, everything you've said there opens up a lot of topics I want to talk about, but I'll actually tell you a story from my own life, which is kind of frustrating for me. When my mom passed away, she died quite young. There was some conflict about what we were going to do to remember her and mark her grave, so to speak. And I was all for scattering her ashes at the base of a tree up on our family property in the mountains outside of Seattle. But for the older generations, that was just too much. They really needed a place to go to, a place to visit on a regular basis. So In the end, she was cremated according to her wishes, but then buried in the family plot, which is here in an urban area of Seattle. The irony is that after a couple of decades passed, we had to sell that land. And in the end, they cleared that land. So in the end, my grandparents were correct, right? I mean, it would have been kind of a disaster for us as a family if they had listened to me in the long run. But it does point to, I think, some of the things that Better Place Forests are doing.
Your story is very similar to why we started Better Place Forests and my personal experience. My father died of a stroke when I was 10. He was much older and much more traditional, so he wanted a traditional burial. If it had been 15 years later, I'm sure he would have wanted his ashes spread on our family cottage up by the lakes in Ontario. A year later, my mom died. So I spent my life going back to their grave in a cemetery, and having that place was important. I think when grandparents say things like, I want them to be in a cemetery, I want a place to go back to, I think often many people come, particularly if they're environmentally inclined, with a negative association with cemeteries. They often see them and they see concrete, they see tombstones, they see grass. They don't see it as a natural place and they want to be in nature. And I think that's very important. At the same time, people often forget the importance of that permanence. I like knowing that my parents' names are on a tombstone somewhere. I like the idea that 100 years from now, someone's going to see Douglas Gibson and wonder who Douglas Gibson was and wonder what his story was, and see Ann Gibson and wonder what her story was. I wish their story could be told better than a tombstone in a crowded cemetery. And that's why we started Better Place Forests, is really to solve both of the problems that you and your family dealt with, which is how do you give people a place to come back to? How do you give people a place to be together in a family plot? And family plots in many cities are hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is very, very hard to buy a 10-person contiguous plot anymore. At the same time, how do you want to be somewhere beautiful? And what's important that we've discovered is some of our customers, when they hear nature, they're driven towards conservation. They're driven towards protection, legacy, and sustainability. Others, their first instinct is beauty. They hear nature and they go, oh, the most beautiful places I've ever been are in nature. And to me, what's really important is that both of those are noble instincts and they both support each other. Whether someone's looking for beauty, whether someone's looking for a legacy of conservation, they're going to get both. And I think that's really important to me. So we created a place that could solve all of what your family wanted for your mom. And when I hear about the story of selling the property and getting clear cut, that is really, really common. One of the number one objections we get from people, particularly wealthier families, they hear about Better Place Forests and they go, that sounds great, but I want to be on my farm, or I want to be on this. And then we get a lot of calls later on saying, hey, can you move this tree onto your property? And of course, it's very, very, very hard, and it's extremely unlikely that someone can move a 50-year-old tree. So it's unfortunate. And I think that's the beauty of having permanent protection and beauty and nature.
I want to come back to this thing that you mentioned, water cremation. And recently, the death of Desmond Tutu brought attention to end-of-life practices that are more environmentally friendly. He had done to his body aquamation or alkaline hydrolysis. And honestly, I didn't know about that until this had been an item in the news. Apparently, it uses 90% less energy, this process. I wonder if you see his choice as signaling any kind of cultural shift in the conversation about end-of-life choices.
There's two parts to that. First is water cremation, and the second is how is the discussion around end-of-life changing? And let me answer the first one. Water cremation is great. It's not widely available yet. It's difficult to get the facilities permitted, but it's something that we're very supportive of, and we've had a number of families choose. And the end result of water cremation is that the bones still come out as bone ash. You know, it's important whether it's flame cremation or whether it's water cremation. The ashes that you see are small bone fragments. It's the remains of the bones. In either case, the rest of the organic matter either is dissolved or it's burned away. And those bone ashes are very good in nature. They need to be mixed with local soil. They need to be mixed at the right ratio, and they need the bacteria in that soil to break them down before they become nutrients for the soil. But it is effectively very similar to bone meal. So it will become part of nature much faster than a traditional body would, for example. And some people choose recomposition. which is legal in Washington. It's one of the few states where it is. And I think that's fabulous as an option. But all those options are things that we support and very much believe in. We think people should be able to choose their form of disposition, and then they should still be able to choose being in a beautiful forest.
By recomposition, just to clarify, what do you mean by that?
Recomposition is a naming for body composting. It's a process where the body goes into a vessel, typically for around 20 to 30 days, sometimes less, sometimes more, where the body will break down into soil quite quickly. So it directly produces soil, whereas water and flame cremation produce ash that needs to be mixed with soil before it breaks down into nutrients. The second question on Desmond Tutu and are people changing their way of thinking about death? I would say they are, but they're still very much avoiding thinking about it. Death, particularly in American society, is something we don't like to think about. Obviously, for personal and professional reasons, I think people should think more about it. One of the things that I grew up noticing was how incredibly rare it was for me when talking with my friends that they had ever experienced death at a very close level. Death is often something that people don't want to think about and they don't know about it. And they want to make a decision like it's an afterthought. Whereas I think it's very important to think about death for two reasons. First, I think knowing that you're going to die helps you be a little more intentional about how you want to live. And second, I think people need to remember that those last moments of your life, the people who love you, they will never forget those moments. I often say, I can never forget each of my parents dying. I will never forget their funerals. And I will never forget the image of their final resting place. And all of those, I think, could have been much better. That is an opportunity for you. They often say that there's two things that bring together everyone who loves you, your wedding and your funeral. People spend a lot of time on the wedding, and I think they should spend more time on the funeral. My uncle was very intentional with his funeral. He saw my mom, his younger sister, die when she was 46. And so he had prostate cancer for a long time. He had a very well thought out funeral plan. And the night before the funeral, he wanted something very specific. He wanted his 6 kids. He wanted me and my brother, and he wanted a few of his cousins, and only those people, to get together at his house. He wanted his body to be there. And he wanted us to tell his favorite jokes, drink his favorite wines, beers, and whiskeys, which was funny because he had terrible taste in beer, and eating his favorite cheeses of Stilton and Jarlsberg. That is not expensive for a funeral, but it is one of the best memories I have of my uncle. And he wasn't physically there, but he said, "This is how I want you to remember me." And I will always have that memory with him of that beautiful moment. So I think that the intentionality can lead to these better experiences for families.
Mm-hmm. Well, death, of course, has everything to do with religion. So when you think about the times when you've had to engage the religious beliefs of your clients, what have been some of the more difficult moments, and how have those encounters maybe shaped the way that Better Place Forest engages the spiritual beliefs of clients and potential clients?
Religion is always a difficult topic. I think the main thing where religion can get difficult is with family. Often people can get very, very traditional after someone dies. And where the hardest times I've seen are where someone expressed a desire for what they wanted and didn't tell their family. And their family's coming in going, "No, I know them. I know exactly what they would have wanted." And another sibling or a child says, "No, I know them," and they wanted something different. It can actually be one of the number one areas which causes fights for families. And so one of the things that we say is when we're helping families with their funeral planning, I often tell them that saying what you don't want is just as important as saying what you do want. It is very important if, for example, you don't want a traditional mass for your funeral. You have to tell your family that, because if they don't know that and they are devout, they probably think you want one. I was helping a customer plan some of her funeral decisions recently, and they weren't traditional funeral decisions like where am I cremated, that thing. It was more, she just wanted to think about a celebration of life and how she'd be remembered. And she specifically said, "I don't want a traditional funeral. So what can I do?" And after we talked through it, it was really fun. I said, "Well, who's going to be there?" And it was her nephews and her nieces and some of her best friends. I said, "Do you want to be indoors or outdoors?" And it was very important she was outdoors. I said, "Okay, where does your family live?" And she lived in Northern California. So she said, "So I want it to be there. What are your favorite foods and favorite drinks?" She said, "Drinks? Tequila." I like margaritas. I said, okay. And what's your favorite food? She's like, I just like grilling. And by the end of that conversation, we realized that her memorial, her goodbye, her celebration of life should be an afternoon barbecue in a park. And when we were going through it, she was a devout Catholic. I said, do you want a traditional funeral? She said, I really don't want a traditional church funeral, but I do want to invite my priest. And there's two nuns I've always really liked. I would like them to be there. And I thought that was just a beautiful tie of tradition and religion with something new. She had the people that she wanted together to remember her. She has them drinking her favorite drinks, eating her favorite food, and still has her connection to the faith. That is how I think religion can fit in. I think there's kind of unlimited possibilities, and we just have to be flexible at how to make them happen. Other families have a full traditional funeral, and then they're cremated, and then they have a celebration of life. Our chief real estate officer, he wants a full-on after party in Montana with all of his favorite drinks, all of his favorite foods, catering trucks, and he wants the best party of his life. He's just not going to be there. I love that plan.
Maybe you could talk about how Better Place Forrest started in the first place. I mean, what were some of the early influences and experiences that led you to do the work that you're doing today?
So I've always been an entrepreneur. I started my first companies in college. When I was 10 years old, I started my first devil stick making business. It's those juggle them with two sticks and the stick in the middle. I don't know what else they're called. And my mom was very proud. She's like, this is great. Drove me to Home Hardware so I can buy all the doweling and start making the stuff and start selling them. And so I've always believed that entrepreneurship is really important. It's the way that we create new things. At the same time, I very strongly believe that businesses should have positive externalities, not negative externalities. So a negative externality is you run a pig farm and you dispose of all the extra waste in the river. That's obviously a very negative externality that you shouldn't be doing that. Positive externality is how do you create a product that actually leaves the world better than it was before? Some of the great examples are people making designer shoes out of waste plastic. That's a great positive externality. The more shoes get bought, the more waste plastic goes away and doesn't end up in trash. My best friend and business partner, Brad Milne, our COO, and I were talking about new ideas. We used to run a software company in Canada. We were talking about what we wanted to do next. And I very much liked the idea that you could find something that had a positive spin on it. And I'd read a book called Cradle to Cradle. And Cradle to Cradle is an amazing book. It's one of the first books that inspired the design thinking movement around environmentalism. Not business is bad, we should reduce economic growth, but more of how do you redesign a business process so that it's good? And one of the really famous examples was they got brought in to work on a chemicals factory in Germany. And at that point, that factory was disposing of a lot of waste into a river. The new design that they came in, they said, well, tell you what, why don't we stop using river water as an intake and let's start recycling the water from our existing process. And what they discovered was that was actually better because there was no waste in water form that was going into the river, but also it meant that they were always using distilled water that was incredibly predictable, as opposed to when they were using river water that changed from season to season and made it really hard to run the same processes at a very high level of fidelity. So approaching a business as a design problem and saying, how do you create a sustainable, economically positive business, I think was possible. And when we were talking about different ideas, trees instead of tombstones came up. And actually the origins of Better Place Forest were that Brad had sent me one of these articles and I said, this is a terrible idea. There is nowhere to put these things. There is no way you could sell these things and make money. It's a nice idea. I don't ever see it working. And 5 days later, I was at my mom's grave, my parents' grave for my mom's birthday, March 1st, 2015. And I remember standing there and their cemetery plot is like 15 feet from the street. And it's right by a bus stop that the city of Toronto put there. And I'm standing there and it's a shiny black granite tombstone, which seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a terrible idea. So you see the cars driving past you reflected in the tombstone. And that is just not how you want to feel when you're visiting. I'm sure you get to visit your mom sometimes. And I don't know, crying in public is not something I like doing. Feeling emotional and vulnerable in public is something I really don't like doing. So, a cemetery in a public space is not ideal. And I'm there seeing these cars and I'm like, God, I hate this place. And then the bus stopped and it's like that loud, screeching air brake sound. And I was like, there's got to be a better place than this. I was like, that's actually a really good idea. And I walked out of the cemetery and I called up Brad and I said, I know what we're doing next. We're going to do the tree thing, but we're going to own the land. We're going to be the land. Specifically because in that moment, I realized I don't visit that often. I want the visits to be good. I want them to be beautiful. I want the memory to be beautiful. And if that means I have to drive an hour and a half, that is perfectly fine by me. Heck, if my parents could have been in Muskoka, which is 3.5, 4 hours from Toronto where I lived, or in Whistler, BC, because that's the last place I ever spent with them, I would love them to be there. I'd visit less, but I'd know they were in a place that mattered to all of us and that was incredibly beautiful. And that's the image that I want. I want to think of my mom. I want to think of a beautiful place. So that is the origin of Better Place Forest.
Clearly, we can see the benefits in terms of earth care to this approach, but I think that it goes even beyond the creation of memorial forests. I wonder if you could talk a bit about your partnership with One Tree Planted and about that sort of added environmental benefit and what the intention is behind that.
The vision of Better Place Forests is to help every person write a better ending to their story. I think everyone can. We don't get to choose how we're born, but we do get to choose a fair amount of the end of our life if we want to. And part of that, I believe, is the importance of giving everyone a chance to know that they've left the world a little bit more beautiful than they found it. So we partner with One Tree Planted. When you buy a tree in a Better Place Forest, we plant between 25 and sometimes more than 1,000 impact trees. And those are planted in drought and fire affected areas of California and the United States. And the reason for that is that we realized early on the forests that we buy need to be relatively close to cities or need to be in a really iconic location like Yosemite or Mendocino. And so we're buying very expensive land. We're protecting 20 to hundreds of acres each time. Typically, our smallest forest is now 40 acres. So it's going to be in the tens to hundreds of acres, not tens of thousands of acres, because the land where you can have the maximum impact of reforestation is very, very far away. So by doing this, we maximize the environmental impact while also creating these really beautiful places that people want to go and visit and be remembered in.
I am guessing that a lot of listeners are hearing your message, hearing about the company, and really responding positively, like this is something that we could do potentially, but there's a problem. Better Place Forest is not all over the world, much less all over the US. I'm wondering, what are people to do with that? I mean, is your plan to grow the company? Are there other companies like this? I mean, maybe comment on what people are to do with this knowledge that they're gaining.
So my hope is they come to the website and sign up no matter where they're from. Currently, we have 9 forests open, 5 of which are in California. We're throughout California from Lake Arrowhead in the south up to Mendocino in the north. We are in Arizona. We're in Minnesota, Illinois, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. So we have 4 forests that are currently open. We do have a 5th that will open either later this year or next year in California. And then we're going to be expanding across the country. We're, of course, going to keep opening forests to cover everywhere possible. Now, it's not easy. No one's ever written a county development code with the contemplation of a memorial forest in it. So when we go to counties and we say, hey, there's this beautiful land, there's a landowner that wants to preserve it, we want to come in and turn it into a conservation area, and we're going to spread ashes beneath people's trees. That's just a new business model that was not contemplated well. So we've got to work very closely, and it just takes a lot of work to work with the neighbors, to work with the county, to get permits to be allowed to operate and open. So we're trying to expand as quickly as possible. I would say I love the emails that I get asking why we're not somewhere yet. My answer is always, we're working on it.
It's a strange idea to think about, but is franchising a possibility?
I don't think the economics for franchising would make sense. It's fairly expensive to open a forest. Take the most iconic franchise model like a McDonald's or a Wendy's. Typically, they're going to charge you something like $2.8 million for that. And a lot of that is paid for with debt. So there are lenders who will lend to someone who wants to pay the $3 million for a franchise. Otherwise, I don't think the numbers would work. There's not enough people with $3 million sitting around saying, I want to open a McDonald's. Of course, we do partner with land trusts. So we have some land trusts that have beautiful properties that want to turn a portion into a conservation area for a memorial forest like ours that is close to a similar franchise concept where we partner with them. But currently we don't. I think franchising would be very expensive at this point in time.
Well, the fact is that the listeners to this podcast are really from a global audience. So we have people on every continent who listen to this. So I'm wondering if you could help us with the potential takeaways from this conversation for them. Like, what difference could the things that we're talking about make to them as they think about end-of-life planning?
So I think the single most important thing for everyone to remember is that when you die, every single person who loves you is going to remember that moment and the moments afterwards for the rest of their lives. It is an opportunity to make it beautiful. It's a gift that you can give someone of planning ahead and thinking through what you want them to do. And even things as simple as notes. You know, my mom had terminal cancer for 7 years before she died. She never left a note to me and my brother because it's such a hard thing to write. How do you write that final note? You want it to be perfect. I mean, what I would encourage people to say is that perfect should never be the enemy of good. Get that small note card and just say, "Dear Forrest, I hope you know how proud of you I am. I'll always love you, Grandpa." Like, that is all that's needed to have an enormous impact on someone's life for the rest of their life. So I strongly encourage people to do that, to think of the things that matter to them. What's your favorite hymn or song that you want played? What's your favorite food? When people die, they're looking for those moments of connection. And if you can say, my favorite drink, my favorite wine is a William Sellium Russian River Pinot. I had it for the first time in like 2012, and I never knew wine could taste so good. I would love to know that my friends got together and drank a bottle of that wine and said, "Sandy, I get it. I feel connected to you now." Those are beautiful, beautiful moments. And I think we can all do that. No matter where we are, no matter what the cost is, we can tell people how to remember us and how much we cared about them. And I think the world would be a much more beautiful place if everyone did that.
In terms of earth care and sensitivity to the environment, are there choices that people can make in their planning, even if they don't have access to a Better Place forest?
Again, being clear to your family that you would like a cremation, a traditional cremation with carbon offsets, or water cremation, or a natural burial are all good options. It's just important to tell people what you want. Offsetting the costs of a traditional cremation is not particularly expensive. It's not hundreds of dollars. It's probably in the tens of dollars range. So if that's important to someone, just tell your family. They're going to be spending a lot more than that on the cremation. Adding a little bit more to choose a cremation provider who offsets those cremations is fairly straightforward. And then again, telling people what you want for your ceremony is also very important.
It seems to me that you are creating these opportunities because you've had the courage to think beyond what is, and even to walk forward into things that other people might at the outset consider ridiculous or undoable. In terms of, generally speaking, our approach to earth care, I wonder if you could talk about that. Talk about the power of creative thinking, of enterprise, of shaking up conventional models in order to do things better in terms of earth care.
Yeah, so I love this conversation. In general, the conversations I've had around it fit into two camps. One is folks who say business is business and it should have nothing to do with making the world better. It's about profits. And the other are folks who often come from the standpoint of business is bad. It's just about profits. It can't make the earth better. And the answer is both of those camps are wrong. The key, again, is looking at books like Cradle to Cradle and saying, how do you design a business model that's good? How do you design a business model where the output of the product is something people want to buy, and the externality, the thing that happens as a result of making that product, is good for the earth? And I think that's the key thing, because people forget that businesses aren't moral or immoral. They're organizations designed to generate profits. And profits are really, really important. They're not bad. Japan in the 1980s, the reason they've had almost no economic growth since 1990 pretty much is because they built a massive economy with no profit. When they realized it was highly leveraged and they had economic troubles, there was no way for businesses to say, okay, well, we're going to lose money for a couple of years. We have lots of savings. They had no savings. They were heavily, heavily indebted to their own banks. That doesn't work. You have to create a successful, profitable business. But the best way to do that is by building a product that is actually good for the world. You look at fashion companies like Rothy's that designs its luxury shoes out of recycled materials. That's inspirational to me. That's a good idea. And why it works is because you're going to consumers and you're saying, hey, normally you buy luxury materials. How do you want to buy beautiful materials that make the earth better? That to me is very compelling. That's possible. There's an interesting and controversial sometimes discussion is Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A decided to get into coffee. When they decided to get into coffee, they spent 5 years building a supply chain where something like more than 200 to 300% more money ends up in the hands of local villagers who work there, because they designed it very specifically saying, how do we create coffee? How do we work with local farm collectives, local nonprofits to make sure that these profits go back to the people who actually work on the coffee? All of this is possible if you just start with the intention of saying, I want to make a successful business, which means I want to create a product that customers want to buy. And I want to make sure that in the act of making that product, I want the supply chain to be better for the world. It's totally doable if you say those are the two things that we're going to achieve, that we want to achieve. And I think if more people entered with that approach of saying business can be good for the world, and here's how we're going to make it that way, I think you can get there. I totally believe it's possible, and I hope Better Place Forest is an example of how it's possible.
We've been in conversation with Sandy Gibson of Better Place Forests. For more information on topics covered in this conversation, go to the show notes for this episode on the podcast website. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please share this episode with a friend. You can also show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. Finally, it would be very helpful if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. I'm Forrest Ginsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Ulfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening. Please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.